Lorraine. We're going to continue our lecture series here to try to get you caught up on history since we're not on the same time schedule here. We were at the election of 1876. This is where we were talking about Reconstruction when I did see you on Skype the other day. So election of 1876. Samuel J. Tilden was a Democrat, and he was leading Rutherford B. Hayes, who was a Republican, for the election of 1876 in both popular and electoral votes. Remember, we had the electoral process. Well, I think we've talked about that. So there were 20 electoral votes that were in dispute at that time. So a 15-member commission with 5 representatives, 5 senators, and 5 Supreme Court judges had to decide who was going to receive those votes. You probably don't need to know those details, but you do need to kind of know the process and what happened, because it led to a compromise. So a compromise was reached in 1877, and this was the compromise. The Republicans received all of the electoral votes, which gave Rutherford B. Hayes the presidency. Right? In turn, the Democrats got to have the removal of all the Union troops from the South, which ended Reconstruction. And remember, Democrats, Republicans, their ideology is a little different now than it was then, so it gets a little bit confusing, I know. And so many of the parties changed names along the way. But at that point, the Democrats were the ones who wanted the removal of the troops and all of the congressional rulings that had to do with Reconstruction and in the South. So that's what they got. The Democrats got removal of all the Union troops from the South, which ended Reconstruction. A term you need to know is home rule, which of course means that in whatever, but in Reconstruction in this time period, it meant that when the Republicans pulled the Union troops out, the South could then rule itself, which it hadn't done since the Civil War. It had always been under the Union control. The troops were in there to make sure they were following the rules of Reconstruction. So this was the first time. So they were on home rule. This post-Reconstruction time, so then we've moved from Reconstruction to the post, which is the after, is known as home rule. The home rule pleased the Redeemers, and that's just a term you need to know. And those are the ones who tried to get rid of all the Republican influence from the South during Reconstruction. So those are called Redeemers. For over a century, every Southern state would vote Democratic in presidential elections, and that was called the Solid South. Now, when you say Democratic, as we've talked about, it seems like it has switched now, that you wouldn't have, the South would be considered Democratic today. But that's the way it was. It was called the Solid South because they voted Democratic altogether for 100 years. All right, and some other definitions you need to know: sharecropping and a crop lien. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with that term. So newly freed slaves often still had to work for their former masters because they really had nowhere else to go. They didn't have any other skills or any ability to go do something else. But they weren't slaves anymore, but they worked for terrible wages. They lived an impoverished existence as sharecroppers. Okay, and sharecropping is a term you'll need to know. Sharecropping means that when you farm, you only get a share of the harvested crops, and much of that profit goes to the landlord for rent. So the landowner rents you the land, you grow the food, you then only get a share of it, and you have to pay rent out of that profit. So they were barely making out any kind of an existence at all. In the crop lien system, the landlord provided supplies, but there was a lien on the crops that hadn't been grown yet. So the sharecroppers experienced extreme debt or poverty, and both, because they owed money, and then if the crops if they didn't have a good year, then they just kept getting further in debt, and even in a good year, they weren't making very much money. So sharecropping and crop lien were just, you need to know those two terms having to do with people who were trying to make money on the land after the Civil War, slavery, newly freed slaves, but they were living in poverty. It was pretty awful. And that practice continued up into the 20th century. Another definition you need to know, and I know we're going pretty fast, but you know we have to get through material. So if you have questions, just mark them if there are some gaps. The Jim Crow laws. You absolutely need to know what the Jim Crow laws were and what they meant. In history, it's believed that the term Jim Crow came from Thomas D. Rice, who was a minstrel show kind of making fun of black culture. There was no real person named Jim Crow, but the laws were all about separate but equal. The idea that you could separate or segregate blacks from whites, and that was okay because as long as you were treating them equally, you were giving them bathrooms, and you had white bathrooms and black bathrooms and white schools and black schools, that was okay. Schools, water fountains, everything was meant to be separate but equal. At least that was the law. That's the Jim Crow laws. But of course they weren't. They often weren't. Anything that was designated for blacks was usually substandard, not as good, not as well taken care of. It just obviously wasn't fair. After the Supreme Court upheld the separate but equal, the Supreme Court actually, it came before them, and they said, yeah, that's good. As long as it's separate and equal, separate but equal, then it's fair. So we're going to go ahead and let you do that. And that was Plessy versus Ferguson. You know, that's how the Supreme Court laws are written. I think you have a list of those. So it would be 1896, Plessy, Plessy, and then you just put V for verse, Ferguson, Ferguson. Okay, so once the Supreme Court said, yeah, that's good, Jim Crow laws are fine, they can survive, they did until the mid-20th century. So that's why in the South there was segregation for all those years. Because the Supreme Court said, as long as you're separate and equal, it's fine, it's legal. The problem is in the South, it wasn't equal. It was separate, but it wasn't equal. The blacks definitely did not have as good schools, anything. So that was a problem. To avoid the 15th Amendment, Southerners used all of the following things I'm going to give you. And the 15th Amendment gave the black people the right to vote. But of course, in the South, they didn't want them to vote. So they did everything they could to make it hard for them to vote. So they were afraid, of course, that African Americans would vote opposite what they wanted because they had such opposite ideas and life. So they were worried about that. So there was no secret ballot back then. So they were intimidated at the polls. People could come up and bother you while you were at the polls. It wasn't a secret what you were doing. And as early as 1875, the Mississippi Plan organized such violence against African American voters to keep them from voting. A poll tax or a tax to vote, which sounds outrageous now, but they would actually, before you could vote, a free black person had to present a receipt showing they paid their tax, their poll tax, their tax to vote, a fee for voting, which we don't do now. And of course, people who were poor, which was a lot of the blacks in the South with the sharecropping and not having jobs and having been slaves, they couldn't afford a fee to vote. So, of course, they couldn't pay the poll tax, which meant that they couldn't vote. So that was one way to keep people from voting who you were afraid were going to vote in opposition to your beliefs. The 24th Amendment to the Constitution outlawed this practice in 1964, quite a bit later. Literacy tests were another way to keep black people from voting. Remember, a lot of black people never had the opportunity to have an education, obviously, or learn to read. So they came up with, to keep blacks from voting, they came up with a test, a quite difficult test. And if they couldn't pass it, then they couldn't vote. Now, whites did not have to take this test. Only blacks had to take it. And the way they got around the laws on that is they called it a grandfather clause. Grandfather clause today in most things means that if it's already been established, you're already a part of something and the rules change, you get to be grandfathered in, it's called, which means that you don't have to start over. You get to go along with it because you were already doing it. So it's like they can't come up with a new law that hurts you. So in this case, the grandfather clause was literally, if your grandfather could have voted in the election of 1860, if he voted in 1860, so he wasn't a slave, he was somebody who could vote, the literacy test would not disqualify you from voting. Of course, those with white grandfathers could vote. So the grandfathers of newly freed blacks had never been able to vote because they had been slaves. So obviously the grandfather clause worked for white people. It would never work for black people. So white people did not have to take the literacy test, and the black people had to take the literacy test. So you can see it's a very unfair system, obviously unfair system. And that's what they intended. That's what they wanted in the South at the time. So there you go. A definition, the New South. If you hear about the New South, these are just terms you need to kind of be able to refer to and know what they mean. After the Civil War, there was a movement in the South for more industry with less dependence on the plantation system. Remember, we've talked about the plantation system and how dependent it was on slaves, but also just on the fact that they didn't have a lot of industry in the South, and when the war broke out, that was obviously a problem. Some cities like Atlanta did industrialize, get more industry in, but most other areas did not add a significant amount of industry. The Gilded Age, 1870 to 1890. We're moving ahead a little bit here. Mark Twain coined the term the Gilded Age to describe the period between 1870 and 1900. Now, gilded means that something that appears gold on the outside is really junk on the inside. So it's not a good term, positive term. It seems as though everything is great in this era. We've gotten through the Civil War. Some good things are happening. The country's growing. But everything isn't great. There are always underlying problems. And in this area, there are robber barons, and that's a term you need to know. And that is a term for people who grew very rich by monopolizing or taking over industries. So some of the rich rose to power after being poor, but in truth, 1% of the population controlled nearly all of the wealth, which is interesting because that's what people say today. So this is a long time ago, but we still seem to have some of the same problems. The labor class was exploited both as workers and as consumers. Unions tried to form to gain rights for workers, such as an 8-hour day. Despite that and despite the strikes and all the things that went on, the skilled and unskilled labor never really got as much of the money, they call it the piece of the pie, as the people who were in charge and making amazing amounts of money at the time. And you'll hear some of the names of people in steel and Vanderbilts and Carnegie, and some of the names you'll need to know of people who gained great wealth in this time period. To complicate things, this was also a time when millions of immigrants came to America looking for work in the factories, and because of that, there was a response to the people who lived here that was anti-immigrant, which also sounds very familiar. That's called nativism. Nativism is a term that refers to trying to protect the interests of the native born. It's a feeling of opposition towards foreigners based on the fact that this is a nationalistic idea, that this is our nation. Nativism existed during the first great wave of immigration. You remember we talked about the Know Nothing Party. They disliked all immigrants, especially because of the anti-Irish immigrant, the anti-Irish Catholic feelings about anybody coming in. They had the signs up that said need not apply. There was just a lot of nativism at that time. And later nativism led to other problems with other immigrant groups. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, will be a little bit later, limited Chinese immigration. The Gentlemen's Agreement of 1907, which is later, obviously, when Japan agreed to limit immigration to the United States. and that was after Commodore Matthew Perry opened up Japan to Westernization. They had not wanted to get involved. The Japanese government said, no, we do not even come here. We don't want anything to do with you. Commodore Perry went there anyway, and once it opened up to some kind of Westernization and they started modernizing, Japan started modernizing their economy, many people wanted to come to the U.S., and then immigration was limited. They could come, but they faced segregation and discrimination. In 1917, a literacy test for immigrants was passed, even though the president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, tried to veto it. And it was motivated by xenophobia, which is hatred and fear of foreigners. So this is all, some of this is a little bit later, but it all kind of shows you the idea of nativism and how it kept going, and there were more and more laws put into effect against immigrants and for the natives, not Native Americans, of course, but just the natives. And that was just before U.S. entered into World War I. The Quota Acts of the 1920s is another example, and the National Origins Acts of 1824, which we will cover a little bit later, but this does all kind of have to do with nativism. And that set limits on immigration, especially from Southern and Eastern Europe. This meant that government policy favored the more assimilated or Americanization of immigrants from Western European nations, such as Britain and, well, mostly Britain, because they're more like us. Immigration from Eastern Europe was greatly curtailed. Just means it was pretty much slowed down and stopped, because people who were less like the Americans were not as welcome as people who they felt assimilated, could come into their culture and be a little bit more like them. Okay, we will go back to that a little bit later, but just know that's an ongoing issue, immigration. So that is important to know. Getting back to the wealthy people in the Gilded Age, remember Mark Twain actually coined the term the Gilded Age. And it means, like I think I said, gilded means gold on the outside and junk on the inside. And there was a lot that went on during this period in terms of industry and invention. But bottom line is, most of the common people who were not super wealthy and didn't have access were poor and struggling. The definition of robber barons and trusts. You'll need to know those two, because that's very important in this time period. Many of these people were considered captains of industry, which sounds very good. They were people who developed or created certain parts of industry that were very beneficial to the country as a whole, and they got very, very wealthy doing it. But the term robber baron was often used to describe those same industrialists or people who controlled the monopolies or trust. A monopoly or trust is when you are able to control everybody, everything within that industry, so there is not any competition. If you don't have competition, then you're able to charge whatever you want, treat people however you want, because you don't have the competition or anything to stop you. Okay, and some of the monopolies or trusts you need to know. Andrew Carnegie is known for steel. Cornelius Vanderbilt for the railroads. John D. Rockefeller for oil. Those are the names you will most likely see on any kind of a test, and just know that those have to do with people who made a great deal of money in these industries that were pretty much locked up in trusts or monopolies. Now, a lot of those people have given a lot of money to the country and in philanthropy, and you'll see schools and there'll be colleges and hospitals and, you know, Carnegie Center. All of these people did donate a lot of money, but still there was a lot of problems when they were making all that money. So something you also need to know, the name Horatio Alger, A-L-G-E-R, and he was known for writing dime novels, they called them, which were kind of simplistic. They only cost a dime at the time, which is why they call them dime novels. About men like Carnegie who went from rags to riches during the Gilded Age. You know, the idea that you could come from nothing, and success stories. So if you hear about Horatio Alger stories, they're usually like you start from nothing and you end up being fabulously wealthy. So it's kind of a anybody can do it, rags to riches kind of a thing, but it wasn't that easy. Okay, a trust forms when one company takes over the stock of a competing company in trust agreements, and this often creates a monopoly where one huge corporation controls almost the entire market. You don't have any competition, and so then the prices are often manipulated. Years ago, the telephone companies were one of those, because if you only had one phone company, that you would have to pay whatever the rate was. You couldn't really complain about service. It wouldn't do you any good because you had nowhere else to go. So later on, there was big push to break up some of these monopolies and trusts so that there was competition, because competition encourages businesses to do a better job and to lower their prices because they have to actually compete. To control most of the steel industry, Carnegie bought out all the raw material and the railroad lines associated with production. So nobody could stop him or compete with him. He just bought up everything, all the raw materials, all the railroad lines that he needed to produce the steel. This is called vertical integration, and that is a term that you might need to know, so write that down. It has to do integration. Vertical integration means that he bought everything. Think of vertical and horizontal, because there's also horizontal integration. And vertical integration means you buy everything that you need, all the way from bottom to top. He bought the raw materials, the transportation needs, so he bought everything that was needed for that. He also looked to buy out similar companies or merge with them and take them into his big monopoly. And this is called horizontal integration, where you pick up all of these others, so you have everything else. And vertical is just what it sounds. You're going from the bottom up. You have raw materials and everything. So those are two types of integration that you might see on the test. So just write that down. Okay, another definition you'll need is the gospel of wealth. And this was Carnegie's decree that the super rich should be charitable and give back to society for the common good. So as I said, some of these people made a lot of money. It might not have always been made the right way. They definitely stepped on some people and took advantage of the ability to create trusts and monopolies. But Dale Carnegie did believe that super rich had a responsibility to give back for the common good. Not everybody thought that. And it felt that his fortune should not be squandered and should be donated to those wise enough to spend it. It wasn't just to be wasted. And he really, Carnegie Hall, and there are a lot of Carnegie names that you'll see. He did get a lot of money back, his family. But that's just one of the names you need to know. Another term is social Darwinism. Now, you're probably familiar with Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, the survival of the fittest, that, people, animals, creatures, anything that is stronger will survive to then procreate and go on. This notion was also used in business. This was survival of the fittest in the business world, so it's called social Darwinism. And this was used in defense of all of those monopolies. Basically, if we can take over and we are better and we can succeed and wipe out others, then we deserve to be here. So these same Darwinian principles, take that same theory and take it into a social theory, business, would be applied during the age of imperialism when the United States took over foreign territories. If we're bigger, if we're stronger, then that's the way it is, just like in theory of evolution. The strong survive, the fittest survive. So Darwin's theory of evolution also was used in other areas in terms of justifying what was done. Edward Bellamy, Bellamy, wrote a utopian novel called Looking Backward, 2000 to 1887, and he gave a socialist view at the future. He showed how government reform movements would one day save the world from the evils of the trusts. So that's just a name you need to know. Utopian novels have always been popular, but that was Looking Backward, 2000 to 1887, giving a socialist view at the future. So just know that name. I'm not even sure how that would come up on a test, but the name Edward Bellamy, Looking Backward. President Ulysses S. Grant. Remember we talked about Civil War, General Grant, the great Union general. He was elected president. So Ulysses S. Grant, there were some scandals during his administration during the Gilded Age. So if you hear these names, you will need to associate them with some scandals during Grant's administration. And these were at the beginning of the Gilded Age. And these I'm sure you will see because one is called the Credit Mobiler. I'm going to spell that for you. It's just CREDIT, and then it's MOBILIER, and it was 1872. And it was a scandal where the railroad companies and construction suppliers were owned by the same people. So the people who the railroad companies and the suppliers of construction were owned by the same people. So the supplier, Credit Mobiler, was charging crazy inflated prices for construction materials. And the government-backed Union Pacific paid those prices. So, of course, with inflated prices came bribes and kickbacks to the congressmen involved. So it was one of those things where a lot of money changed hands in Congress because the Congress backed the Union Pacific Railroad, and the construction company was owned by the railroad company, and they just inflated the prices, and it was just a big mess. So Credit Mobiler, 1872, just remember that is a scandal involving the railroads company owning both the construction materials and the railroad company. All right. Another one is the salary grab of 1873, when Congress voted itself a 50% pay raise, because Congress votes on its own raises. Other salary increases were in the same bill. They just decided to vote themselves a huge increase, and that was called the salary grab of 1873, and it was when Grant was president, and he signed it right before his second inauguration. Third scandal during his time in office was the whiskey ring of 1873. And it was a scandal in which federal whiskey taxes wound up in the pockets of distillers and politicians. So it was basically a scandal of bribes. Grant's private secretary in his administration was also accused of being involved in that. So the whiskey ring was federal whiskey taxes ended up in the pockets of politicians, distillers. It's the corruption, money, and politics. Okay, Boss Tweed, a name you need to know. Boss Tweed and the political machine. So Boss Tweed is just boss, and then Tweed is Tweed. And he's the head of a political machine, they call it, and it's called Tammany Hall. And you do need to know this because if you see Boss Tweed, Tammany Hall, they go together. And it's Tammany. Last name is just Hall. It has to do with a political machine in New York City where people voted early and often to support the Democratic Party. And that is a joke, a bad joke, but it is was so blatant. The corruption was so blatant and so obvious in the politics of that time in New York that people would say vote early and vote often. And of course, you know, you're only allowed to have one vote. So when they say vote often, they know that, you know, they're stuffing the ballot boxes, or they're doing illegal things. It's political corruption. That's what it was. Tweed's ring basically ran around New York as members of the Democratic Party controlling all the powerful offices there. They pretty much just took over and ran everything. Tammany Hall also helped immigrants find jobs in exchange for votes. So as immigrants came in and were able to vote, they would get them jobs, but they would have to agree to vote for them, which is also illegal. New York was an oasis of corruption. Corruption is just, you know, when everything is going wrong and everybody it's based on bribes, political, the voting is illegal, everything is being done for money. None of it is working the way our founding fathers meant it to work. It's all being power and money. So New York just became known for that. For the municipal, which is the city, it wasn't all the whole country, it was just New York, and the city politics just got crazy. So it was a city corruption. Bribery and kickbacks were common. Kickbacks is when you get paid for doing a favor for somebody, or which is not legal. The New York Times eventually exposed Boss Tweed and his ring with a series of cartoons, and the cartoonist was Thomas Nast, N-A-S-T. So if you see some of those cartoons with Boss Tweed, I might show you some because you need to recognize them. He's shows him as the most corrupt politician. He's an example of corruption in politics. Boss Tweed. Everybody says that. It's like, okay, we know who you're talking about. It's all about corruption and money. He did go to prison after he was prosecuted by Samuel Tilden. So Boss Tweed ended up in prison for bribery and all of that. So at least that's good, huh? Okay, so next we're going to go on to the Pendleton Act of 1883. Okay, the Pendleton Act of 1883 was in response to the patronage system, the spoil system. We talked about it earlier, where once a president or someone was elected in high office, they would give jobs to their friends, and people who had supported them had nothing to do with whether they were qualified or not. After President James Garfield, who was the 20th president, was assassinated, this was an attempt to stop that system, and it actually did. It provided for a civil service test, which meant that you had to take a test and be somewhat qualified to get a job in the government. And that's the way it works today, is people take tests, they have to qualify, and then they get moved up in jobs depending on their qualifications and how they do on tests. So it's called the civil service test, and it's still in effect now for federal, any kind of government jobs. So that was the Pendleton Act of 1883, and the idea was to stop the spoils system, or the also called the patronage system, where candidates just appoint their friends and supporters to office. Okay. You also need to know about some of the labor groups. The Knights of Labor, Knights of Labor, was founded in 1869, and it was an industrial union led by Terence Powderly. His last name is Powderly, and unions started to organize because the workers were not being treated fairly, between long hours, low wages, some of the way they were being treated. So the way to combat that was for unions to form. So those are just groups of people getting together in that industry or in that business and try to work together to use that kind of force to solve the problem. So the Knights of Labor was 1869 it was an industrialized union, and it had over 700,000 members by 1886. And that union fought to end the child labor, which it's hard to believe, but we had children working 12, 14 hours a day instead of going to school, working in these factories. It fought for an 8-hour day, which is a normal length of working for the day, and an equal pay for equal work. So people would get paid the same. They also allowed African Americans and women to join their group. Of course, they weren't getting equal pay, but the Knights quite often were involved in strikes. Although Powderly was against using excessive strikes or doing it too often, he felt it needed to be done when there was no other recourse. A strike is just a refusal to work. So when a group goes on strike, they just say they're not going to work. They usually go outside with picket signs and let everyone know why they're striking to get the public behind them. So one of those labor unions was the Knights of Labor. Think of Terence Powderly with that. They at one time had over 700,000 members. They were fighting for to end the child labor and also a more fair balance of pay and 8-hour day. All right. Sometimes unions had to deal with lockouts, which is what the term used when employees don't allow workers in until they agree to the terms that the company wants. So if they say these are our terms, and the employees say no, they lock them out so they're not making any money until they agree, which most people can't afford to just not work. Another obstacle for labor at that time was called yellow dog contracts, and that prevented workers from joining a union if they were to work at a certain job. So there were some places where the yellow dog contracts meant that they were not allowed to join a union. So then they didn't have the protection, they didn't have the bargaining of the union. All right, another union you need to know is the AFL. Very important union in our country's history. Most people know the AFL is the American Federation of Labor. And that was founded in 1886, and it's considered a craft union because it's where people of similar jobs or crafts are grouped together. Okay, so it has to do with a labor union, whether they're workers, steel workers, factory workers, whatever it is. It's a labor force, and they have a similar interest, so they group together to have more of a say. So their early leaders were Samuel Gompers. It's hard to forget that one, Gompers. And he urged striking only when necessary. And he fought for bread and butter issues, are called. Bread and butter issues are like the 8-hour day and higher wages, things that really matter to people in their daily lives. Bread and butter usually refers to people, literally, obviously it has to do with food. Figuratively, it's the basic necessities that people need, bread and butter issues. 8-hour day, higher wages, basic financial topics that affect the daily lives of their workers, of their union members, and that's what they were going for. The AFL promoted collective bargaining. It's a very important term. It's used today also. That's where employees met with employers to compromise and discuss differences of opinion and contracts. So collective bargaining means that, we have a lot of people here, so if we can collectively get together and negotiate, then we have more of a force. One person goes in and says, I want to negotiate this contract. It doesn't work that great. But if you have a lot of people behind you, you have collective bargaining, you have someone going in and representing a wider range of people. So here's how you can, so think of the bread and butter issues with Gompers, and less striking and more collective bargaining, more trying to come up with a compromise. The Knights were a little bit different. They, of course, still wanted the better working conditions and to get rid of the child labor laws, but they were a little more willing to strike. Another one is the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World. They were also called Wobblies. They were founded a little after the Gilded Age in 1905. But they were led by a very vocal socialist, Eugene Debs, D-E-B-S. They were the most radical of all the unions and were largely comprised of new immigrants. So the more radical means probably they were the more active, a little more threatening, because some of the other unions that I just told you about were trying to bargain, trying to negotiate, and would go on strike as a threat. They would go on strike if they weren't getting any response, but they were trying to bargain. All right, so the IWW is a little more radical, a little more willing to be a little more extreme, and they were comprised of a lot of new immigrants. The Molly Maguires, called the Mollies, were Irish-American coal miners in Pennsylvania, and they belonged to a secret society, and they were labeled anarchists who opposed the entire establishment and government. They were working for the labor rights in the mines. Mines were just terrible places, and the working conditions were horrible. So they were fighting for that. And again, they were definitely more radical. They were more violent. They opposed the government. They were working for rights in the mines, and in the 1870s, many of them were charged with a number of crimes. Some were executed. Not sure if the evidence was really there. So much went on in those days that you don't know how fair it was, but they were known for that, and there were some that were even executed because of it. The mugwumps, a definition that you need to know, the mugwumps, MUGWUMPS. And the mugwumps, during the 1880s, the Republican Party was divided again. The stalwarts, the old guard, the people that were really kind of wanted it to be the way it was, and they were more conservative than what they called the half-breeds. Those are the people who favored some civil service reform. The Mugwumps were so dissatisfied with our party that they voted for a Democrat, Grover Cleveland, against the Republican James Blaine in the election of 1884. So they went against their normal party because they were pretty worked up. And Cleveland won. So Grover Cleveland won the election of 1884.